I'm Still Here by Infinite Songbird on AO3. Chapter 7, The Star. Dear Dad. Hi, Dad. Pops. This is weird. I'm not really sure what to say. Lance says writing to you should help with homesickness, but I'd rather talk to you in person. Not like you're ever gonna get this. I can't exactly mail it. Oh, shit. Oops. You don't know who Lance is. This is going well. Okay, long story short, Lance is So I met this boy. I think I kind of might be starting over. Space is totally amazing. I feel... Fuck it. Not like you didn't already know. I feel free up here, Dad. Hell, I just got chills. I feel like me here. Isn't that weird? I don't know. But for the first time in my life, I feel like there's a point. I'm sorry, I feel bad for even writing that. You worked so hard to give me everything you could, and I just feel like... My point is, you were right, and thanks. I miss you, and I wish you were here every day. Shiro misses you too, by the way, obviously. We both missed our dad. This letter looks terrible. It's kind of funny. I do hope Lance didn't ask to see it, though. Oh, still haven't told you who Lance is, or I guess who he is to me. Truth is, Dad, I wish I knew. I hate you. Keith, I'm serious. I'm never talking to you again. We're gonna be old and decrepit, and I'll still never forgive you. It's not that bad. Keith shot his cousin a glare, tugging uncomfortably at the chest plate of his bright red spacesuit Shiro had bought all those months ago from Eden's Euphorium. The thing had to be literally ancient. Keith is pretty sure he'd never seen the model in his life. It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, he hissed, scowling down at the suit's red and white arm plates and ignoring Roth sniggering behind him. And if you fucking... He hurried as Shiro opened his mouth to speak. Mention this stupid goddamn sale again, I'm going to punch you. Shiro had the audacity to laugh, and Keith kicked petulantly at his shin. Shut your fucking mouth, he grunted, face growing redder as Roth's boisterous laughter was joined by Rave's tittering. When Keith turned to glare at them, Rave blew him a kiss. It's strange, said his fucking traitor cousin, his mouth pulling upward into a smile that Keith instantly hated. You never cared this much about your appearance. Something changed, little cuz? Sticking a couple fingers into the suit's rigid collar and wiping at the sweat dribbling down his neck, Keith leveled Shiro with the most venomous glare he could muster. I know what you're doing, and I'm not playing this fucking game with you. His cousin's idiotic grin stretched even wider. Oh yeah? You gonna play it with Lance? Well, would you look at that? Oh, no. Keith had been dreading that voice ever since Shiro had procured the worn black and red atrocities from his duffel bag that morning. He'd been hoping that he might suffer a mysterious and fatal accident before Lance had to see him in it, but he turned, miserably preparing himself for an afternoon of teasing jabs at his expense, and promptly inhaled in a shock at the sight of his best friend. Holy shit. Lance grinned at him, clad in, of all fucking things, a matching suit. Blue where Keith was red and Shiro was black. Keith hated how good Lance made it look. Eden's Euphorium, right? Lance asked, freeing Keith from his blinding smile as he turned his attention to Shiro. Yes! Shiro practically crowed, shooting a shell-shocked Keith a triumphant grin. There was a sale, I know! Lance laughed, his eyes shining with giddy light that made it impossible to look away. Eden's prices are the best. You just gotta know how to haggle. Thank you, Lance. I've been trying to tell Keith that all morning. At the mention of Keith's name, Lance stepped toward him, his smile growing gentler by the second. How's my grumpy pants this morning? Keith swallowed, trying to remember how to form words. Good. Oh, you're good now? Shiro asked indignantly, shoving at Keith's shoulder before turning to address Lance. He's literally been complaining about the suit for an hour. Oh, yeah? Lance appraised his outfit, and warmth bloomed across Keith's cheeks. Well, I think you look pretty sharp, cabin boy. Before Keith could release whatever embarrassing, inhuman noise was crawling up his throat, Silver's signature whistle was cutting through the air, and Keith had never imagined he'd be so grateful to hear the sound. Smacking his knee like an old man, Shiro grunted as he rose from the crate he'd been sitting on. That's our cue, gents, he sighed, turning his back on the two younger boys to lead them to Silver's waiting figure at the helm. Let's go fix some ship. Keith was just about to follow him when something brushed against the back of his neck. He whirled to find Lance grinning sheepishly at him, hand still hovering in midair. Sorry, your hair was stuck. Oh, Keith touched the end of his ponytail, trying once again to figure out how the hell words were supposed to work. Thanks. No prob. And, Lance trailed off, shifting his weight restlessly from foot to foot. I mean it. You look good. You look good. Praying that the expression on his face belied the frantic pounding of his heart, Keith tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear. Yeah? The smile was back again, all lopsided and soft in the lines of Lance's face, and Keith felt lightheaded and giddy, as if he were somehow floating miles above his own body. Yeah. He couldn't stop laughing. He wasn't supposed to be laughing. He was supposed to be dangling precariously from the side of their ship, clad in a stupid red spacesuit, held only by the harness around his waist. He was supposed to be working, buffing the ship's outer hull and fixing all the remaining damage from the Leviathan's attack the previous week. He was supposed to be on a mission, navigating the dangers of space with the fate of the universe laying heavy on his shoulders. Instead, he was studying the way Lance's eyes sparkled every time he made Keith laugh. Instead, Lance was bellowing, incoming, as he used his harness to swing over Keith, ignoring Shiro's pleas for caution. Instead, Keith was laughing so hard there were tears in his eyes, releasing his own hold on the ship and swinging to meet Lance, breathless when they met, spinning around one another with smiles that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Instead, he was caught. No, helpless, ensnared, and falling. Thorne was late, and Keith was miffed. She'd never been late, but punctuality was a virtue she'd drilled into his skull the hard way. Even now he shuddered at the thought of tardiness. He viscerally remembered the day he'd overslept and been dragged out of bed by a tail tightly wrapped around his ankles, only to be greeted by Thorne's unamused scowl as she hefted him over her shoulder. He hadn't been late since then, honoring their daily rendezvous with the dedication of someone who'd suffered enough of wrath and rage laughter for a lifetime. But now it was Thorne who was late, and Keith paced restlessly. He had half a mind to storm down the cruise quarter and drag her out of bed and see how she liked it. "Sup?" Keith jumped, so lost in his own thoughts that he hadn't even heard Lance approach. "Wow," Lance grinned, shoving his hands into his pockets as he leaned against the banister. "Someone's tightly wound today." Attempting to keep the scowl plastered on his face was an almost monumental task in Lance's presence, but Keith folded his arms across his chest, rolling his eyes for good measure. Thorne's late. To his bafflement, Lance laughed, pushing himself away from the banister and leaving Keith with a grin. Leveling Keith with a grin. "Actually, I'm late." Before Keith could ask what in the hell that was supposed to mean, Lance dropped into a lunge, arms raised above his head as he stretched his torso. "Thorne can't make it today, so you're training with me." Tearing his eyes away from the exposed sliver of Lance's hip, Keith managed an intelligent, "What?" The other boy snorted, straightening up with a teasing glint in his eyes. "You, me, fight good. Teach me how to fight better, yes?" "I know what you meant, asshole," Keith grumbled, fighting a smile as he socked Lance in the arm. "I mean, where's Thorne?" Lance shrugged, rolling his head in small circles. "Busy, indisposed, eloped with Coran, take your pick." This time, Keith was fully unable to stop the surprised bark of laughter that left him. I'm gonna take a wild guess and say it's not that last one. With a far more dramatic flourish than necessary, Lance unbuckled his weapon's holster before setting it aside, and Keith hurried to follow suit. "I don't know, Keith. She's been sending Coran some mad goo-goo eyes. Shut the fuck up and fight me already." Keith snickered, falling into a crouch, and Lance's answering laugh was well worth the number of times Keith proceeded to be knocked onto his ass. Fighting with Lance was always markedly different than it was with Thorne. While it was a relief not to have to worry about 5 extra limbs, years of training under Thorne's tutelage were evidenced in Lance's skill and precision, rendering him just as formidable a sparring partner. Keith had observed weeks ago that Lance possessed a strange ferocity that Thorne did not. Where she was precise and calculated, Lance was unpredictable and cunning, able to read his opponent's intentions so infallibly that he always seemed to be several steps ahead. It was infuriating. It was thrilling. It was fucking painful. Ow. Fuck. He'd already eaten deck about 5 times before he saw an opening. He was, for a split second, at exactly the right angle to sweep Lance's leg out from underneath him, and before he could spare it another thought, he was lashing out with a grunt. Lance went down so hard that Keith almost froze in shock, rooted where he stood in sheer disbelief. But then Lance was staring, and Keith was carried forward by feral instinct, pinning his best friend to the ground with a hand to his chest. "Gotcha," Keith panted, feeling a manic grin spread across his face as he gasped for breath. I win." Beneath him, Lance cocked an eyebrow, his face schooled into a carefully blank mask. "Sure about that?" Yeah." He tapped Lance's chest. "You're down there. I'm up here. So..." Keith yelped as the wind was knocked out of him, and suddenly he was staring up at blue and green. "If you're gonna pin someone," Lance started, now silhouetted by the sky, "make sure you do it right." "You fucking cheat," Keith grunted, attempting, to no avail, to wriggle out from under Lance's firm grip. "I won that one, fair and square." Tapping a finger against Keith's nose, Lance hummed, his mouth curling into a smirk. "How come you're down there, then?" he snarked, sounding far too casual and collected considering the fact that Keith was completely winded. "'Cause I'm not a fucking cheat," he managed as he squirmed, beginning to giggle against his will. "You're not getting up till I let you up, doll." Keith froze, the pet name rendering him altogether incapable of thought. He was suddenly hyper-aware of how close the two of them had gotten, aware of the sweat dripping down Lance's temple, of the light dusting of freckles across the bridge of his nose, of the thin span of distance between them that shrunk as Lance tapped his chest and stood. Keith's eyes fluttered open as the other boy's weight left his chest. He hadn't even realized they'd slipped shut. Anyways, Lance reached down to offer Keith a hand. "That's, how you do it." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, and Keith wondered if maybe he'd taken more of a beating than he was letting on. "Got any questions?" Keith said intelligently, feeling his face heat. They'd been so close. "Don't think so." "Cool." Lance shoved his hands into his pockets, leaning back against the banister and shooting Keith a mischievous smirk as he watched him crack his back. "Because, I could totally show you that flip again if you... Oi, little blue." Accompanied by the sound of his distinctive deck-shaking footsteps, Roth's booming voice was jarring as it cut through their conversation. Keith whipped around, backing into the banister to rest at Lance's side as the hulking alien shot Lance a strangely saccharine smile. "What's up, big guy?" Lance's face settled into the cool mask of indifference he so often wore around their crew, and Keith wondered, a fleeting intrusive thought, whether Lance's smile might return if Keith took his hand. "Captain said we're approaching the outer rim," Roth rumbled, the same strange glint in his eyes. "Less than a couple months from the cannon now." Huh. There was something cool in Lance's voice, so subtle that it was almost imperceptible. But when Keith looked at him, he was the perfect picture of nonchalance. "Been a while since we sailed these parts." The chapped, calloused lips on Roth's stomach curled into a wicked smirk, as if Lance had just delivered the punchline to some private joke, and then the hulking alien was continuing on his way as if he'd never been there. Keith waited until Roth was out of earshot before leaning conspiratorially towards his best friend. "Okay," he mumbled, drawing the word out warily. "What the fuck's his deal?" When he turned, he found Lance gazing off into the distance with unfocused eyes and a vacant expression that sent shivers down Keith's spine. "Hey." He wrapped a hand around Lance's cybernetic wrist, careful to avoid the sharp edges of the exposed machinery. "You okay?" Multicolored eyes snapped to his before flickering away just as quickly. "I'm fine," he reassured, though the smile he wore was nothing more than a phantom echo of the one Keith had grown so attached to. "Actually, just remember that Silver wanted me to check that one finicky latch down in the longboats, so I'm gonna..." He trailed off, jerking the thumb over his shoulder as he spun and backed away from Keith, whose stomach was sinking by the second. "Oh," he tried not to sound too disappointed, but the sentiment seeped into his tone like water into a washcloth. "I thought we were, face on fire." Keith gestured stupidly at the deck, and Lance winced, still backing away. "I know. I'm sorry, Keith. I gotta go." He didn't wait for an answer before turning tail and practically jogging across the deck, leaving Keith very much alone and wholly unable to shake the creeping sensation that something was deeply wrong. "No!" Keith jolted awake, his heart racing as Lance's yell pulled him violently from his slumber. For a moment he was gripped by panic, wondering if the ship had been attacked. But then Lance sobbed, and Keith was crawling through the dark as fast as his knees would allow, blindly reaching for the silhouette of his best friend. "Please, no!" Lance bucked in his sleep, his voice wet with tears, and Keith nearly collapsed over him in his rush. "Hey, Lance! Lance! Wake up, it isn't real!" A pair of flailing arms almost caught Keith in the face, and he clutched at Lance's clammy palm in his own hand. "Hey, it's me, it's Keith." In his grip, Lance's writhing slowly stilled, and Keith could imagine the other boy blinking blearily up at him through the darkness. "You're safe. It was just a dream," Keith reassured, stroking a thumb across the hand in his and wanting so badly to plant a kiss there. From out of the darkness, a voice hoarse and cracked with sleep croaked, "Keith?" Keith smiled, reaching tentatively through the darkness until his fingers met soft curls. Although feather light, the touch was met by a sharp inhale. Keith hesitated briefly before sinking his fingers into the sweat-plastered hair, and when Lance relaxed under his soothing ministrations, Keith gave the other hand in his own a squeeze before guiding it to rest over his pounding heart. "Yeah, it's me. I've got you. You're safe." A whimper was the only warning before Lance was sobbing, turning his face to seek the warmth of Keith's palm. Obliging the both of them, Keith ran his thumb along Lance's wet cheek, threading his fingers through the ones pressed against his heart. "Hey," he whispered, his heart breaking with each sob. "Please, don't cry." To Keith's horror, the sentiment seemed to achieve the opposite effect. Lance's sobs turned so desperate he was nearly wailing, as if he were trying to forcibly expel all traces of grief from his body. Every crackling gasp he managed to draw was so mangled that Keith wasn't sure if he'd even be able to speak in the morning. Deciding he could no longer bear the sound, Keith followed the impulse that guided him down onto Lance's bedspread, their knees bumping together as he situated himself on the floor. Loath to waste even another second, he breathed, "Come here," into the space between them, drawing Lance into his arms as if this quiet intimacy were a natural thing between them. In the light of day, Keith might have felt self-conscious, but under the cover of darkness, he held Lance as if he were a precious thing, steadfast and unrelenting long after his tears had run dry and sleep had reclaimed them both. Lance's nightmares worsened the closer they drew to the outer rim. At first, Keith was content to chalk it up to the rigors of their journey. Silver had been working them to the bone, and a combination of muscle ache and stress was sure to warrant restless nights and agitated dreams. But as nights spent holding Lance grew more frequent, Keith began to wonder exactly what ghosts plagued his slumber, what memories stole the glint from his eye and hardened the lines of his face. Not even Lance's marble, warm to the touch when Keith would retrieve it from under Lance's pillow in the dead of night and press it into shaking hands, seemed to bring him much solace. With each passing day, he seemed to retreat further into himself, and Keith's heart ached to understand the reason for his melancholy. He wondered, fleetingly, if perhaps Lance was simply embarrassed by their new, almost nightly ritual. But that didn't explain the way Lance would wrap him in a crushing embrace under the cover of dark, breath tickling against Keith's neck as he desperately pleaded with him to stay. And stay Keith did, keeping a close vigil night after night, and wondering when he'd grown so weak. However badly Keith wanted to talk to him, to ask what tortured him, Lance seemed to have developed a sixth sense for intimate conversation, as well as a special talent for avoiding it. Every time Keith attempted to broach the subject, Lance seemed to suddenly remember he had business somewhere else, leaving Keith's unvoiced questions to die on his tongue. It was clear he had no desire to talk, and while Keith didn't want to push it, he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand to watch Lance slowly fall apart. None of Keith's questions were answered until they reached the outer rim. Signs of life grew more and more sporadic the deeper they traveled past the rim's boundary, life on the ship falling into a dreadful tedium. Lance seemed to go through greater effort than ever before to make himself scarce, and all conversation between the two cabin boys grew as vacant and lackluster as the boy's smiles. Keith wondered if the version of himself that had set out to space all those months ago, the version that had harbored an angry, stupid grudge against the boy he hadn't known, would have ever even noticed Lance's subtle shift in demeanor. He certainly noticed now. It was on their third night in the outer room that Shiro found him sitting alone atop the banister after dinner, huddled against the mesh roping as he brooded. That evening had marked the second screaming match between himself and Lance that the galley had ever witnessed, and Keith was too busy stewing over the entire encounter to greet his cousin with more than a grunt. "Hello to you, too," Shiro chuckled. "Where's your other half?" "Don't." It came out quieter than he meant it to, a stark contrast to the humor in his brother's voice. "Please don't joke about it." "Okay." Shiro held his hands out in surrender, his tone growing gentle. "I'm sorry." The two of them fell silent, Shiro carefully picking his way toward Keith with measured steps. He settled with his back against the banister, hands in his pockets and shoulders relaxed, his signature do you want to talk about it stance. A few more seconds passed before Keith finally found any words. "We had a fight," he mumbled, turning away, with his cheek pressed against his knee, staring out into the vastness of space. Keith heard, more than saw, his cousin sigh beside him. "Was it bad?" Keith shrugged, and Shiro sighed again, longer and deeper. "I'm sorry." They passed a few moments in silence before he asked, "Think you two are going to be okay?" The desire to deflect weighed heavily on his chest, but for the first time in years, Keith found that he wanted the comfort, wanted to unload. He was sick of running from himself, tired of hiding when things got tough. He uncurled from his tight ball, drawing a wrist discreetly across his eyes. "I'm not sure," he croaked, and the vulnerable honesty of his admission felt as if he were opening a door. I feel like I'm losing him, Shiro." The unfiltered surprise in his cousin's wide eyes might have almost been funny in any other circumstances. "What happened?" Stinging tears gathered at the corners of Keith's eyes, and his vision blurred. He wasn't sure he could even recall the last time Shiro had asked him that, the last time he'd let Shiro ask him that. "I don't know," he mumbled, rubbing once more at his eyes as he cast a surreptitious look around the deck. It appeared that most of the crew had retired for the night, and the only members left on deck were Corinne and Thorne, who were busy lighting the torches several paces out of earshot. "We were in the galley, and I tried asking him about earlier today, and he just..." The memory of Lance, red-faced with anger as the two of them yelled at one another, flashed through his mind and crawled its way out of his chest. "I guess I just went too far and got totally invasive, and I screwed everything up, and Shiro's eyebrows hiked into his hairline in alarm, and Keith stopped talking with a huff. "Right, he should probably start from the beginning." "Sorry. You remember earlier? Pandora? Do I remember the giant planet we passed?" Ignoring his cousin's attempt at levity, Keith mindlessly picked at the rusted buckles of his boots, his mouth twisting into a scowl. "He's been so fucking weird all week. And then we passed Pandora today and he got all quiet. Did you notice?" When Shiro shook his head, Keith plowed on, words spilling freely from his lips as his heart finally unburdened itself. "Well, he did. And then Silver said something to him. I didn't hear what it was, but Lance looked..." Keith trailed off, unable to adequately express the haunted look that had passed over Lance's face and settled into the dark circles around his eyes. "I did notice he left," Shiro prompted when the silence had dragged on for too long. "Was that because of Silver, do you think?" "I don't know." He was crying again, and Keith wiped feverishly at his eyes, furious to be shedding even more tears. He seemed upset, so I tried asking, but he wouldn't fucking talk to me about it, and he took a defeated, shuddering breath. "I'm just so worried about him, Shiro. His nightmares have gotten so bad. I've literally been sleeping on his roll." Belatedly processing his own words, Keith cut himself off, flushing with embarrassment as his cousin's eyes softened. "Oh, Keith." He sounded so much like their father that Keith was helpless to let the sob that left him. as well as to the way his heart sang with relief when Shiro gathered him up into his arms. He buried his face into his cousin's jacket, inhaling the familiar scent of home that he so ardently missed. "I'm sorry," he spluttered, unsure of what exactly he was apologizing for. Regardless, his cousin pulled away, taking Keith's face in his hands with firm yet gentle hands. "Hey, look at me." Feeling as if he were under a microscope, Keith struggled to meet his gaze through the tears swimming across his vision, sniffling as one dislodged itself from the corner of his eye and rolled down his cheek. Shiro brushed it away with a thumb, his smile so bittersweet that Keith yearned to empty all the contents of his heart. "You don't have to apologize for the way you feel, Keith, you hear me?" He nodded, feeling somewhat childish, and Shiro rubbed his thumbs across his cheeks. "That's my little brother," he whispered, chuckling when Keith nearly choked on another upsurge of tears. "Asshole. Listen to me. You and Lance are going to be fine, okay?" Keith opened his mouth to protest, and Shiro gave the head in his hand a little shake. "No, you are. You've been through too much together to fall apart now." More tears trailed down Keith's face as he nodded, and Shiro sighed, brushing the hair from Keith's forehead with his cybernetic hand. "You're not gonna lose him, Keith," he muttered, something strangely somber passing across his face as he dropped his hands, leaning back against the banister. "How are you so sure?" he asked, his voice wobbling dangerously. Avoiding eye contact, Shiro smiled, nostalgic and bittersweet, as he flexed his cybernetic fingers out in front of him. "Relationships are hard. Letting someone else see all the parts of you is easier said than done." They'd never spoken like this about this, and Keith bit his lip before dismissing hesitation. "Is this about what happened with you and Adam after?" Shiro chuckled softly, his cybernetic hand curling into a light fist as he clutched it to his heart. His gaze roved out over the stars, and the expression on his face sent a wave of empathy rolling into Keith's gut. "I couldn't talk to him about the accident for a year. He breathed, his breath turned ragged, and Keith's heart clenched painfully as he watched the glistening tears slide down Shiro's face. "I didn't know how, and I didn't want him to see. I was so scared." He looked at me differently. I wanted to be the man he married." Keith unfurled his legs from his chest, heaving himself along the banister until he was shoulder to shoulder with his brother. "Hey, you're still you, Shiro. The explosion didn't change that." "You're right," Shiro uttered, his eyes shining with gratitude as he turned to regard Keith. "I know that now. But at the same time, I am different. I know those differences don't rule me, but they're still a part of me now." Fully surrendering himself to his heart, Keith reached for his brother's cybernetic hand, easing it from its tight grip on his shirt, and winding their fingers together. He was rewarded with a wet laugh, surprise flickering through Shiro's eyes as he gave the hand in his a squeeze. "My point is, I wasn't ready to let Adam in for a long time. It wasn't anything he was doing wrong. I just needed to know for myself that he'd still be there after I opened the door." When he met Keith's gaze, his eyes burned with sincerity. "I don't know what's eating at Lance, but it sounds like the best you can do to help is be there till he's ready." "I understand." Emotion broke through his voice, and Shiro cleared his throat. "I understand." He tried in a steadier voice. "If that's not something you want to do, no one would blame you. I know it's not easy to watch someone you love in pain." "No." Shiro's eyes widened as Keith stood, his hand still clutched tightly in his brother's. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm sick of running from you and Dad," and his brain finally caught up with his words, and they careened to a halt as he stood there, praying that Shiro understood his words as the apology they were. Judging from the open expression of adoration on his brother's face, Keith supposed that his message had been received loud and clear. He let his eyes fall shut, breathing through the overwhelming wave of fondness pricking at his eyes. When he'd calmed his breathing enough to speak, he met Shiro's eyes once more, voice firm as he promised. "I'm here to stay." Shiro beamed at him, his cheeks glistening with tears. "Well, in that case, it's good to have you back, kid." An hour later, Keith was tiptoeing down into the galley, nearly vibrating with nervous energy. He and Shiro had spent the better part of an hour concocting Keith's plan, but now that it was time to put things into motion, doubt sank into Keith's stomach like a lead weight. The sight of Lance's eyebrows, tightly knit even in sleep, was enough to cement Keith's resolve. He crept over, careful not to touch his sleeping friend, lest he receive a face full of fist. Lance? Nothing. Keith scrunched his nose, resisting the urge to poke Lance in the shoulder. Lance, he whispered. McLean. Psst, get up. A sharp inhale was Keith's only indication that Lance had woken before he was croaking. Keith? Hey. He let his hand find Lance's shoulder in the dark and gave it a light shake. Come on, wake up and come with me. For what? You'll see. Even in his half-unconscious state, Lance seemed to have no trouble trusting Keith on a whim. A fact that had Keith's stomach flipping with fondness as he helped his best friend to his feet. With Lance leaning heavily into his side, Keith guided him towards the galley's entrance, falling into a crouch as the two of them creeped up the stairs. Before they'd cleared the deck, Keith held up a hand, pausing and now disgruntled but awake-looking Lance in his steps until he heard Shiro's voice wafting through the air. Thorn, perfect night, don't you think? Keith winced, wondering if his brother could sound any more rehearsed and stilted, but reached for Lance's hand before he could lose his nerve. Let's go, he hissed, dragging Lance behind him as the two of them snuck out into the night, past a distracted Thorn, and towards the longboat hatch. It was only after they'd begun their descent to the boat room that Keith realized he had no further reason to hold Lance's hand, and was just about to let go when Lance adjusted his grip, threading their fingers together. What are we doing? He hissed, nearly tripping down the last couple of steps as he tried to keep pace in the dark. Pulling Lance towards the furthest longboat from the door, Keith swiveled, watching Lance's eyes widen in shock at the sight of the prepared boat. I guess you can call it an apology? A host of emotions crossed Lance's face, too quickly for Keith to put a finger on any single one. Finally, it settled on a hesitant wince. Keith, please. Without thinking, Keith reached for Lance's unoccupied hand, rubbing his thumb across metallic knuckles as he held both hands firmly between them. His eyes flicked back and forth between blue and green, subconsciously begging Lance to read his sincerity. When he spoke, his voice was hardly audible even to his own ears. Come with me. For a long moment, Lance merely looked at him, and Keith held his breath, struck suddenly by the unshakable feeling that everything they were and everything they could be hinged on Lance's answer. Then finally, okay. Keith's heart hammered in his ears, quick and elated as his mouth split into what was an undoubtedly moronic grin. In lieu of an answer, he jumped down into the longboat, landing on one of the many blankets he and Shiro had laid out half an hour earlier. When Lance didn't immediately follow, Keith turned to find him staring at the boat with wide eyes and slightly parted lips. He caught Keith watching and cleared his throat, cheeks darkening as he gestured down at the mess of blankets and pillows. What exactly is all this? Struggling, Keith turned to survey the boat's contents, making certain he'd brought everything he wanted to include. Picnic basket? He said, jerking his chin towards a small crate tucked between blankets. Stuff to keep us warm, pillows in case you want to sleep. Lance giggled, and Keith's heart nearly stopped. Keith, did you fucking loot storage? Offering his best friend a hand, Keith shot him what he hoped was a charming smirk. I did not loot storage. The other boy sniggered, and Keith nearly sighed with relief when Lance's hand slipped into his own, warm and soft and sure. He eased himself down into the boat, and Keith resisted the urge to place a hand on his hip for extra support. Predictably, Lance made a beeline for the food, and Keith chuckled at the expression on his face as he ripped off the crate's lid. Keith, we could get in so much trouble for this, he whispered, eyes shining in a way they hadn't for several weeks. The thrill of adventure lay thick in the air between them, infectious and wild, and Keith's hands shook with excitement as he pulled himself back out of the boat, clambering over the release hatch. Beneath him, Lance stared up at him, as if he were something brilliant, and Keith shivered under his gaze. We could, he agreed, watching the hatch split open beneath them to reveal an endless pool of stars and sky. but isn't that kind of the fun of playing hooky? Wind whipping through Keith's hair as they tore through the sky, the sound of Lance's unbridled laughter intoxicating beside him. As his mirth climbed, so too did Keith's recklessness. Before long, Keith was piloting like a madman, spinning and speeding and tumbling, anything to keep the crinkle at the corner of Lance's eye, the dimple in his cheeks, anything to keep Lance looking at him the same way he looked at the stars, as if he were in the presence of something awe-inspiring, something breathtaking. Anything to watch the deep blues and purples of the Ethereum dance across Lance's face as he leaned over the side of their boat, eyes sparkling as he trailed a hand through glittering nebulous clouds. Anything to keep the ecstasy thrumming through his blood for just a little longer, to continue to pretend that he could stretch one night into an eternity. Long after Lance had wrestled the thrusters out of Keith's hands and their revelry had climbed to chaotic peaks, they'd almost lost the fucking food over the side at one point. A silent understanding had passed between them, and they navigated back to the ship with stomachs that ached from food and laughter. They latched the boat to the rope pulley, working in perfect sync to heave it upward into its port until Lance yanked too hard on his side, nearly sending Keith flying onto his ass as the boat tipped sideways, and the two of them nearly doubled over with laughter as they attempted to throw one another off balance. Exhausted and spent, they collapsed back into the boat the second it was moored, sitting so heavily that it creaked as it swung on its hinges. With a happy sigh, Keith came to terms with the fact that he'd likely fall asleep right then and there, stated and unconcerned with the world outside their bubble, content, as always, just to be in Lance's company. There was movement against his shoulder, and Keith startled slightly, not having realized that his eyes had slipped shut. Beside him, Lance hissed through his teeth as he bent his cybernetic knee, pulling it toward his chest and fiddling with the gear. With his breath held high in his chest, Keith sat up, bottom lip between his teeth as his eyes flicked between Lance's leg and his face. It was rare for Keith to be privy to such a sight as this. More often than not, Lance insisted on tightening his gears whenever he wasn't in the room, and Keith had grown accustomed to the way that Lance avoided talking about his cybernetics altogether. Now, Keith tried not to gape as Lance openly tinkered away, tightening and twisting with the occasional grunts and click of his tongue. "Does it hurt?" The question slipped from Keith's lips before he could stop it, and he felt his cheeks heat in mortification as Lance paused, casting him a sideways glance. As if debating his answer, he held Keith's gaze for a few seconds before turning back to his leg with a shrug. "Nah. Sometimes it gets too tight and pinches the nerve, but other than that, just annoying more than anything." Lance hissed in pain as his fingers slipped from the knob he'd been trying to twist, sliding against the jagged edge of his knee. When Keith reached for him in alarm, Lance merely shook his head, sticking his thumb into his mouth. "It's fine," he managed around a finger. "Fucking happens all the time. Perks of shitty cybernetics." As if to prove his point, he shook out the injured hand and returned to his work, his face twitching in pain as he applied pressure to his finger. Keith was moving before he could think better of it. He shifted to kneel in front of Lance, ignoring the way his eyes widened in surprise as Keith took both hands in his own, easing them away from his cybernetic with a gentle squeeze. Lance's eyes met his in question, and Keith swallowed. "Let me?" It came out even softer than he'd intended, uttered low into the space between them. For a couple of seconds, the two of them merely breathed one another's air, Lance's eyes darting back and forth between Keith's as if they were trying to read. What? Keith wasn't sure. For the first time in his life, he'd let it happen. He'd let himself be read, placing every ounce of trust he'd possessed in his brother's advice, and letting his own metaphorical doors swing wide open, inviting Lance to enter the depths of his very soul. "Please," he thought as he watched blue and green trail over his face. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm yours." It was incontrovertible, Keith realized. It had been for a long time, perhaps even from the start. Irrefutably true, terrifyingly certain. It wouldn't have mattered how they'd have met or where. The tides of the universe would have always brought them here, adrift in one another's orbit and helpless to the gravitational pull that kept them together. The bob of Lance's Adam's apple was almost lethargic as he swallowed. The nod that followed measured and decisive. In his mind's eye, Keith could almost see Lance's own doors inching open, and he couldn't help the smile that pulled at his lips as he turned his attention to the cybernetics beneath his palm. Ever so gently, he gripped the knob Lance had been twisting between his thumb and forefinger, keenly aware that the other boy's eyes hadn't left his face. "Like this?" he asked, twisting until his twist turned tight. The question was met with silence, and when Keith turned his inquisitive expression to Lance, he found the other boy watching him with a face that was several shades darker than usual. When Lance seemed able to do little more than nod, Keith suppressed a smirk as he returned to his work. "You tell me if it's too tight, okay?" Once again, there was no response. It was clear that Lance had run out of words, not that Keith could really blame him. He'd never touched Lance's cybernetics, save for the occasional handhold, and he couldn't imagine what it had taken Lance to open his door to Keith, even as little as he had. He also couldn't help the little thrill of pride he felt, knowing that Lance had done that for him, no one else, just Keith. Figuring that the growing silence was as good a moment as any to clear the air between them, Keith cleared his throat. "Look, about earlier, I didn't—" "Keith, no!" His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. His fingers trembled around the knob on the outside of Lance's knee, but his attention had returned to Lance, whose face was contorted into a miserable expression. "I want to. I fucked up, okay? I should have never have pushed—" "Okay." Lance folded his arms across his chest. "Well, I shouldn't have yelled. You were just—" He broke off, the fight leaving his face as he met Keith's eyes, his eyebrows rising in the middle. "You were just looking out for me." He sounded suddenly so close to tears that Keith was unable to keep the emotion out of his own voice as he leaned upward, placing a hand on Lance's knee. "Of course. You're my best friend." It may have been a trick of the lantern light, but Keith swore there was a wet sheen to Lance's eyes as he placed a hand on top Keith's. "And you're mine. But there's things about me that I can't... You wouldn't..." "I know." Panic flashed across Lance's eyes, and Keith fumbled with his words. I don't know. No, I get it, okay? There's things that you're not ready for me to know, and fuck, Lance, I get it. Keith laughed, short and manic, all the while inching closer to Lance in desperation to get his point across. "Did you know I'm registered in 2 criminal databases on Montresor?" Lance's brows furrowed, his nose scrunching attractively. "You are?" "Yes," Keith laughed, molten warmth spreading through his chest and softening the lines of his face. "My point is, I get that you're not ready. Hell, you might never be ready, and that's okay." He took a shuddering breath, hoping that Lance could see the sincerity in his eyes. "It doesn't matter. I'm not going anywhere either way." Something dark and poisonous twisted Lance's face, and he looked away, hair falling like a curtain across his eyes. In a voice as coarse as desert sand, he muttered, "You wouldn't say that if you knew." Feeling braver than he ever had in his life, Keith reached forward, cupping Lance's cheek and turning the other boy's head to face him. Lance jumped slightly at the unexpected graze of fingers against his face, and Keith laughed wetly as startled eyes met his own. "There isn't a single thing in this universe," he started, heart thundering through the pads of his fingers as he finally took the plunge, "that could ever change the way I feel about you." They were close now, so close that Lance's breath fanned across his lips. "Keith, Yeah? Without a hint of warning, the ship pitched to the side with a mighty groan, throwing Keith onto his back and sending Lance toppling on top of him. They fell in an uncoordinated heap, a mess of tangled limbs and sharp fucking edges where Lance's cybernetics were concerned. Keith groaned in pain as Lance clambered off of him, eyes wild and hands hovering over Keith's torso. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" "Ow." Keith wheezed, already feeling a bruise forming where Lance had kneed him in the thigh with his prosthetic. "Fuck, I'm so sorry, but we gotta..." The ship pitched further, and their longboat swung so hard that Lance almost lost his balance again. "You gotta get up. Keith, come on." Yanking his arms with the steel grip, Lance hauled Keith to his feet, and together they stumbled out of the longboat docks and above deck. The sight that greeted them was enough to raise every hair on Keith's body and to send his heart rocketing into his throat. Around them, the eutherium was awash with flame. Red and orange painted the sky, glittering embers streaking through the smoky haze. The deck itself had been cast into chaos, and Keith was only barely able to make out Coran's voice from the commotion of the crew. "Fasten all safety harnesses!" Not needing to be told twice, Lance and Keith dove for the mast alongside the crew members, who had the foresight to secure themselves. Keith had just fastened the last strap across his shoulder and had cast a sideways glance to assure Lance Lance was doing the same, when a hand landed on his shoulder. Rolling around, he came face to face. He came face to panic-stricken face with his brother, whose wild eyes instilled more fear within Keith than any of the chaos overhead. "Keith, thank the stars you're okay. I looked everywhere for you, but you weren't in the galley, and I thought maybe you were still out there, and... Whoa, hey." Keith grabbed his brother's shoulders, terrified of his frantic breathing. "I'm okay, Cheryl, all right?" Smoke invaded his throat, dry and thick as it was, and Keith's eyes watered with the urge to cough. He could almost taste the acrid smell of the nuclear fire. What the fuck is happening? The Star of Permusa, Cheryl Rust, casting a cursory glance between Keith and Lance as if to reassure himself they were both still alive. "He went supernova." "Fuck!" Vitriol tarnished Lance's voice. Who the fuck was on watch?" Me," Cheryl croaked. He looked as if he were about to cry, and Keith tightened his grip on his shoulder. "It happened so fast, I woke the crew as soon as I could. McLean! Kagane!" Silver's voice rang out high above the din, and both boys perked to attention, hands flying to salute. A few feet away, the red glow of Silver's cybernetic eye cut through the smoke like a beacon. "Secure all lifelines immediately. Shirogane with me." Keith hardly had time to spare his brother a parting glance before a metallic hand was wrapped around his wrist, forcing him to turn his attention back to the mast. "Come on," Lance urged, looking slightly hysterical as he tightened the first lifeline. "Help me." Adrenaline thrummed through Keith's veins as he set to work, tightening thick rope knots around the metal rungs that lined the mast with practiced ease. He fell into a rhythm, only stopping when he'd come shoulder to shoulder with Lance, hand to trembling hand. "What the fuck do we do now?" He yelled over the roar of the wind, ignoring the part of himself that longed to be mesmerized by the way the fiery embers glinted in Lance's dual-toned eyes. "No clue," Lance yelled back, and Keith was relieved to see that his partner looked just as lost as he felt. "I've never seen anything like this." He cast a glance around the ship, tongue darting out to wet his lips. "They've secured the sails. Good call. This fiery shit'll burn the fuck out of them. And I guess, Captain!" If Keith hadn't been alarmed by the panic in Cheryl's voice, it was nothing compared to the way he felt hearing the strident tones of terror and Thorn's. He turned to find her pointing, reptilian eyes blown wide in fear, in the direction of the exploding star, which had now come into full view through the thick red haze. It was clear what was wrong before Lance muttered, "Oh, fuck me." He grabbed Keith's hand and dragged him to join Thorn at the port side banister. It was clear what was wrong before the captain's voice hollered, "Release the sails immediately! Release!" It was clear what was wrong before Keith's heart practically stopped, his mind struggling to come to grips with the sight of something he'd only ever seen in his garrison textbooks. From the eye of the explosion, a dark vortex was born, hungrily consuming the surrounding matter in its ever-growing maw. If Keith had thought that nothing could rattle him after the Leviathan, he'd been sorely mistaken. Physically unable to take his eyes off the rapidly forming black hole, Keith gripped the banister, and his whole body trembling with fear. Forced to raise his voice over the deafening roar of the supernova and the clamor of the crew, he yelled, "What the fuck are we gonna do, Lance?" If he'd been able to avert his gaze, he might have taken more stock of the sight in his peripheral vision, of the way Lance extended himself over the banister, as if the extra inches might give him a better view. "I don't know." His voice trembled, and Keith wasn't sure he'd ever heard Lance sound so unsure. "But the captain's bound to..." Two things happened at once, in such rapid succession that Keith barely had time to blink. The first thing was a shockwave that slammed into the ship so hard that it rocked side to side, nearly sending Keith reeling back onto his ass. The second thing, Lance went overboard. It had happened too fast for Keith to properly process, and it wasn't until Lance's safety line pulled taut across the banister that Keith registered the yells of the boy hanging from nothing but his harness down below. "Lance!" He didn't have time to call for help as he braced his heels against the side of the ship, wrapping gloved hands around Lance's rope and yanking upward with all his strength. Nature itself worked against him, tugging Lance away as both he and the ship were sucked into the hull's gravitational pull. He'd never experienced such agony in his life. Fire coursed through his limbs, turning his muscles to molten liquid as his elbows locked. His arms felt as if they were trying to dislodge themselves from his shoulders. Pain ripped through his lower back so sharply that he cried out, tears springing to the corners of his eyes. All the while, Lance fumbled to grasp the rope, holding him as he screamed. The sound was awful enough, mind-numbingly harrowing, enough to keep Keith grounded even through the haze of pain that consumed him. Hand over hand he pulled, tears streaming down his face as his vision swam, head ringing and veins throbbing where they strained against his temple. Lance's head had almost reached the underside of the ship when the rope frayed. Keith didn't notice at first, too singularly focused on the task that, if not for Lance's sharp, "Keith, the rope!" he might not have... Oops, my bad. He might not have seen it at all. His eyes widened as it began to snap, thread by thread. Sweat trickled down into his ears as he doubled down on his efforts. Teeth clenched so tightly he felt as if they might meld together. The rope grew thinner by the second, whittling down until Lance was practically dangling by a thread, his hands mere inches from Keith's. The telltale tingle of instinct down his spine was the only form of warning before the rope snapped altogether. Keith's mind went blank as he bellowed, diving for Lance's forearms as his knees slammed against the banister. He was distantly aware that Lance was yelling something below him, though he couldn't make out the words over the blood rushing through his ears. He'd never understand where he found the strength or how, but one second Lance was dangling precariously, metal wrists dangling and digging into the flesh of Keith's palm as he pulled. The next, Keith was falling, his back hitting the deck a second before Lance was tumbling on top of him, knocking the air clean out of his body. For a second, both boys lay trembling together. The cacophony of yelling and commotion faded until it sounded like everything sounded eerily muted, leaving Keith and Lance in their own little bubble. Keith might have wrapped his arms around Lance if he had the energy, but his insides felt as if they'd turned to mud. It was Lance who finally found the willpower to move, bracing his hands against the deck on either side of Keith's head as he pushed himself up, arms shaking with effort. Inches away, green and blue shone with impending tears as they raked over Keith's face. "Keith?" Lance's voice was a broken thing, worn and hoarse from screaming and cracked at the motion. "You saved my life." Raising his arms was more effort than anything he'd ever done in his entire life, but Keith's hand proved steadfast in his short journey to Lance's face. Satisfaction burned through his blood as his palm grazed against the smooth cheek, and his own heart sang with elation when Lance's hand covered his own, as if to secure it there. Lacking the energy to speak, Keith's gaze darted back and forth between Lance's eyes, hoping that his own might convey the words wrapped like a vice around his heart. "You understand, don't you?" he thought, rubbing a thumb along the ridge of Lance's cheekbone, sighing when Lance turned his head to press his lips against Keith's palm. "You feel it too." A sharp whistle cut through the air, and their spell was broken. Lance scrambled to his feet, and Keith might have passed out then and there if it wasn't for the other boy flashing briefly across his fading vision as he hauled him upright. "Keith, come on, we have to move." The panic that laced his voice was insensitive enough to listen, and Keith allowed himself to be hoisted into a standing position as Lance slipped under his shoulder, supporting a majority of his body weight as they ambled toward the midship. "You gotta stay with me, Keith," Lance was pleading. He sounded seconds away from bursting into tears, and Keith was present enough to know that he hated being the cause of that tone. "Come on. Captain says we're going to ride the next shockwave out. We need to hold on to something, but you gotta help me." He wasn't sure when they'd reach the mast, but the breath left him in one little oof as Lance pushed him against it. He crowded against Keith's back, shielding him in a warm pseudo-embrace as his arms surrounded Keith and found purchase in the rungs lining the mast. Around them, everything faded into darkness, and Keith almost thought he was losing consciousness until he realized that the stars were gone around them, all color absent from the great plateau of space as the Melanor succumbed to the black hole. Somewhere someone shouted, "We're not going to make it, Captain!" And Lance's breath tickled Keith's ear as he crowded even closer. "Hold on, sweetheart," came a raspy whisper so soft that Keith wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. "I got you." In the looming face of death, Keith closed his eyes against the screams of the crew around him, able to think of nothing other than his father and brother, of nothing but the words he'd never get to say to the boy curled protectively against him. With a shaking that rattled every bone in his body, in Keith's body, the ship's thruster engaged, just as a massive shockwave collided with the Melanor, sending them careening out of the black hole's giant mouth at the speed of at a speed the ship should never have been capable of. Keith's eyes flew open in time to watch the color bloom back to life, red and orange fading back to blue and purple as the ship was freed from the hole's gravitational pull and propelled back to safety. It rocketed forward, sending Keith's bangs whipping into his eyes and his teeth knocking against each other, until the thruster's power had been spent and the Melanor was slowing to a crawl, drifting unassumingly through the vast expanse of space as if nothing had happened. For a long moment silence reigned over the crew, and then they were cheering, euphorious and elated, the victorious cacophony of a narrow escape from death. A disbelieving huff of laughter ruffled the hair near Keith's ear. "We made it. We're fucking alive, Keith!" The pressure left his back and Lance released him, spinning him by the shoulders so that they faced one another. Lance's hands gripped the side of Keith's face, squishing his cheeks between his palms. "We made it!" he yelled, his eyes wide and voice bordering on hysteria. Without warning, the smile melted off Lance's face, and before Keith could blink, he was being wrapped in a bone-crushing embrace. In a voice thick with emotion, he uttered, "You saved my life." Trembling from adrenaline or fear or fatigue, he wasn't sure, Keith returned the hug, hands circling into tight fists against Lance's back. Indulging himself, he pressed his nose into the nape of Lance's neck, inhaling the familiar scent of sweat and dish soap and his reassurance that they were both alive. When he spoke, his lips brushed against soft skin. "Of course, dummy. He would have done the same for me." Lance stiffened in his arms, and then Keith was being pushed back ever so gently, held by the sides of his arms as though familiar multicolored eyes met his own. He wasn't sure if he'd ever seen the expression on Lance's face, but he looked pained, almost wounded. "Keith," he started, eyebrows tilting upward toward the center. Keith! Lance!" The two of them were practically jumped apart as Shiro jogged towards them, his white hair sticking up in all directions and giving him an uncharacteristically disheveled look. "Are you okay?" He swept Keith's face in his hands the moment he was within reach, gingerly turning it this way and that with an almost deranged urgency. "You're not hurt, right? I was so busy with the sails I didn't get a chance to check if you were okay till everything started going dark, and I could barely see." "Shiro!" Keith grabbed his brother's hands, easing them away from his face and giving him a gentle squeeze. "I'm okay, I swear. Lance is the one who..." The words died in his tongue as he turned, only to find the spot Lance had occupied a moment before to be empty. Confusion narrowed his eyes and knit his brow, and he swept his gaze from across the deck as he attempted to fight off the feeling of wrongness creeping up his throat. "Where the hell did he go?" Shiro muttered, frowning as he turned to look over his shoulder. Keith swallowed, trying and failing to think of anything other than the way Lance had looked at him before he disappeared. "I don't know." His voice cracked, and he finally registered how truly exhausted he was, how bone-achingly numb he was from the night's events. Something in his voice seemed to catch the attention of his brother, who abandoned his search for Lance in favor of placing a hand on Keith's shoulder. "He's probably just giving us some space, bud, or, processing." That was insane. "Human overboard," Keith blurted, his eyes fixated in a blank stare at the balustrade where Thorne was congratulating the captain with a hearty handshake. "He what?" No one noticed. His voice was hollow. "He would have died if I hadn't pulled him up." Stars above. You pulled him up? Yeah. But the gravitational pull... Yeah. He ripped his eyes away from Allura and Thorn, turning his attention back to his brother. I've never been so scared in my life, he whispered, his voice breaking. With a shuddering breath, Shiro bent slightly, reaching to take Keith's shoulder as soon as they were eye level. All right, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have Thorn look you over. No, Keith, I'm not asking, he insisted when Keith opened his mouth to protest. You're going to tell us what happened with Lance, and then you're going to find him and make sure he's okay. You with me? Wanting nothing more than to bump the last item on Shiro's agenda up to first priority, Keith grunted unhappily. Don't give me that, Keith. I'm worried about you. Come on. The hint of tears in Shiro's voice was enough to grab his attention, and Keith nodded with great reluctance, his eyes falling on the entryway to the galley. Okay. By the time he'd been cleared by Thorn and Allura for duty, in this case being code for going the fuck to sleep, Keith was more wired than ever, nearly vibrating with anticipation as he descended the galley stairs, even as Allura had prepared him with questions about Lance's fall, or peppered him with questions about Lance's fall and their irreparable lifeline. Keith hadn't been able to shake the image of that look in Lance's eyes, nor could he shake the lingering sense of dread that sunk its claws into his chest. He'd hardly even said a proper goodnight to Shiro, so preoccupied with Lance's absence that his brother had been forced to chase him for a hug. It was only when he was about halfway down the stairs that he realized that Lance may well have opted to sleep, and Keith slowed his steps. His footsteps measured and gentle in the creaking wood. At the bottom of the stairwell he paused, fatigue and relief finally sinking into his bones as he laid his eyes on his best friend. Lance paced near the sink, his hands balled into tight fists near his head. His hair looked a mess, as if Lance had run his hands through it one too many times, and when he noticed Keith, he froze like a desert critter caught in high beams. For a couple seconds, the two of them stared at one another, Keith's exhausted brain completely incapable of understanding the wild light in Lance's eyes, and even less capable of stringing together any semblance of a question. Then Lance was moving, hurtling toward Keith like a madman on a mission, striding toward him as if he were a cornered animal provoked. Keith took an instinctive step back, his back meeting the wall just as Lance's fist curled around his collar, and then Lance was kissing him. Lance kissed him with urgency, with the extendency of a man starving. Lance kissed him as if it was both the first and last time, as if he might never again get the chance. Lance kissed him as if their lives depended on it, as if he were desperate for it. Months of longing looks and sweet words and fond names and tantalizing, almost culminating in this wondrous moment. Lance kissed him, and Keith responded with matching fervor, pouring into the kiss with 3 words that cemented themselves in his heart. The 3 words he knew to be truer than anything he'd felt in his entire life. He met Lance's confession. Though, was it really a confession, he wondered, when he'd known all along? With a confession of his own, his heart singing with a rapture that he'd never known, could never have imagined. He thought perhaps that all those nights spent watching in the heavens, alone and incomplete, his heart had been reaching for Lance, reaching across the stars and space and time itself for the very thing that would have made it whole. I found you, he thought, hands rising to grip Lance's hips as he greedily pressed forward, deepening their kiss. I finally found you. He was still reeling when Lance's hands flattened against his chest, right over the cannon fire of his heartbeat, and pushed. Keith chased blindly after Lance's lips, his eyes fluttering open when he found nothing but empty space. He blinked as if coming out of a dream, trying to process the sudden feeling of wrongness that sank cold talons into his heart as he registered the expression on Lance's face. If he'd expected to come face to face with the same bliss thrumming through his own veins, pulsing like magic, he was sorely mistaken. Nothing could have prepared him for the pure horror dancing behind Lance's wide eyes, glinting in the form of unshed tears, or the way Lance stumbled back, his hands trembling as they left Keith's lapel. Swallowing around the the building lump in his throat. Keith barely managed to croak, "Lance?" Lance's back collided with the prep table behind him, and Keith was reminded once more of a cornered animal, feral and coiled. "I can't," he choked, the words as cracked and worn as his broken expression. Blue-green flickered back and forth between Keith's eyes, as if begging him to understand. "This is a mistake." Pressure built behind Keith's eyes, and something larger and hot rolled down his cheek. When he spoke, he barely recognized the hoarse voice that left him as his own. "What?" "I'm sorry." It left Lance as no more than a whisper, and Keith became hyper-aware of how great the distance between the two of them had grown as Lance continued to edge toward the stairs. "I'm so sorry, Keith." "I don't understand," Keith wanted to say, but the pressure building in his throat was too much, too volatile. "Just stay." The thought must have been written across his face, as plain as day, because Lance was shaking his head, another apology leaving him on a whimper as he turned tail and ran, leaving Keith shell-shocked and alone in the galley with nothing more than a memory of a kiss and the remnants of a shattered heart. Well, Keith thought as the first sob overtook him, driving him to the floor in a boneless heap. The stars were always out of reach.